So another ability that we can begin to talk about is teleportation, okay, or timeline jumping. So, this is the thing, like, if you don't even know what you're experiencing or how to approach something, it becomes very difficult to practice in it and to get used to it and master it. Okay, so all we have is these stories of the past explained in a way that is not quite adequate for the mindset that was listening and perceiving it in the past. So let me give you an example. The whole planet, this whole reality, previously for however long has been in a third density vibration with a third density conscious awareness, which means it can only perceive inside the reality contextually with the mind that is set up to experience that. So anything outside of a 3D consciousness, it's going to bounce off your mind. Okay, so if we're looking at it in another way, if you're talking in terms of neuro-linguistic programming, they say that the mind creates, distorts, and deletes all this information because you can only, whatever this means, you can only perceive +7 and -2 chunks of whatever the plethora of field of information is out there. So the brain has to condense down and focus in. I guess it's a bit like on your computer. You need a search engine to access what you want on the internet because there's just way too much information out there for you to perceive anything. So you have to sort of hone in on what you're really looking for. And so we delete a lot of it, we distort a lot of it, and we create content and overlay it on what we're perceiving to make sense of what we're seeing. Otherwise, like in the movie The Matrix, we'd probably just see code all the time. So, we're talking about what we would, you've got this third density consciousness, and you're from, say, the fourth or fifth or sixth density of awareness, where this is just normal stuff to you, like quantum physics compared to Newtonian physics. In quantum physics, there's a lot of stuff that you can do that in Newtonian physics is, it's impossible. Okay, so, and that's because you have the observer added in there, and the principle of what you perceive is what becomes your reality, and as you observe it, it manifests that way. So, in other words, if you're not able to observe something, then you won't see it. And we've seen this with attention tests. We've seen this with stories inside What the Bleep, where the medicine man is seeing the conquistadors coming in, and he's the only one that can see the ships because he can see the displacement, because there's no reference in the mind for them to see whatever it is that's out there in the field. And then all of a sudden, when they have the mindset to observe that, then it appears. Just like, here's an experiment for you. If I said to you, and this is an old NLP technique, it's nothing special, but I'm just planting a suggestion here, is that if, all of a sudden you want to go buy this new car, and before you haven't really seen very many of them, but you're researching this car because you're interested in buying it, and not only that, you want it in red. So picture your car and in red, and all of a sudden the next day, as you start to build the neuro network in the reticular activating system, the visual cortex, now that you have the network there to perceive the red car, when you go out there, you see red cars everywhere and in the model that you want, and all of a sudden they're not so rare, and they're very popular. So coming back to abilities, when we're talking about abilities and giving people the networks for their mind to be able to perceive the abilities, which isn't typically part of the conscious reality that they're in. You often have to do it in story form. And so this is why, we're seeing a lot of stuff in the media, like I mentioned before, with the Marvel Universe and, X-Men and all these new series coming out with all this supernatural elements to them. And some are a bit hokey and some are not, and some are very scientific, but they're all there to be able to train people's minds wherever they're at to start to perceive that this is a possible future that's emerging, that's coming. And whether it's coming based on our focus upon it, or whether we're focusing on it because it's emerging, it's sort of the same thing anyway. So anyway, you've got these stories and they're trying to tell you about something that's already in the field that you're not observing. But because you can't observe it in the way that it's showing up, otherwise you would observe it, they have to tell you stories about what it might appear like, which is like a signpost directing your attention toward it, hopefully, that you can start to build a neural network to be able to perceive it. So, unfortunately, for most of us, all we've got are these, biblical stories, these religious stories, esoteric stories, entertainment stories about how it should appear to look if that ability was being played out. Now that's all well and good, but not very often do you get a point of view version of what it looks like to actually be the wielder of that ability. You get to see it played out with people in an environment, in a theatre, but there's not much there to show you what it would look like if you were actually doing it. So, for example, with teleportation and timeline travel, you have to take into account certain frames, like in quantum physics you have superposition, which suggests that every possibility, past, present and future, that could possibly exist already exists potentially in the field of infinite possibility. And what does that mean? Well, that means if this is a matrix and this is a virtual reality, that when you put the goggles on, your VR headset, which is connected to your box, whatever game you put in there, whatever programming that game has, is going to show up in your field of vision. Okay? The potential for every possible game, whether it's a futuristic game, whether it's a game from the past, whether it's a game for the present, whether you're a man in it, a woman in it, an alien in it, whatever, all those potentials exist inside the gaming console, right? So depending on what you load into the console, into your mind, will be what you perceive. So when you're talking about timeline and teleportation travel, like I said in the beginning, because you're still developing a neural network for it, you're going to experience these tiny little glitches. They appear like glitches in the matrix. Things are going to be a little bit out of place or a little bit odd, and you're going to explain them away, that it's just weird, and you're just going to start to accept that the new timeline you're in is the same reality. But if we go back to superposition, we can see that every single potential timeline exists, and in a multiverse theory idea, you're actually jumping between one timeline to the next, to the next, to the next, and each timeline that appears close to the next are so similar. They're so similar that you cannot perceive the difference. Just like as you're watching this video now, this is not actually a movie. These are moments of information, data slides compiled together, and they're playing one after the next switching, and it gives you the appearance of continuity, where in actual fact it's just information, configured in a particular way. And to go deeper into that, so in your mind you're looking at me now, and in the background here we have a couch or a sofa, whatever you want to label it as. But if you didn't have a reference point for what that is, you might, if you were an Eskimo growing up in the plains of Antarctica or whatever, you would maybe think that that's ice in the background. Okay, you see how it can switch, the perception can switch so quickly in the mind. And, in the background you might see the books there, and based on what you are reading, you might think that I'm reading the same books as you, but in actual fact they're totally different books. Or you get the idea. Your brain will start to label and categorize and create and distort and delete what you're seeing based on how your mind's configured. Okay, so when we're talking about timeline jumping, you're actually doing this all the time. You're actually recreating very, very similar timeline jumps all the time, like it's a habitual timeline jump. So when we're starting to get out of our mind, we want to start to create different experiences. So new things show up in our timeline. It shows us we're actually on a different timeline. One of the best examples in story form, one of the oldest ones I can think of, is the story of Ebenezer Scrooge with the ghost of Christmas past, present and future. And it's another neurolinguistic pattern. So if you want to, if you're trying to help someone make a change and they're in a habitual addictive mindset where they're recreating the same life over and over again, because remember, every possible reality exists, even one where you can, even as you get older, you can recreate the same similar frame of life continuously, which to me is a bit of a hell, but that's, it's a personal preference. So what you're doing here is you're skipping from one timeline to the next, and they're so similar and they're so close together that you don't perceive that there's anything going on. It's only until you make these drastic changes and you're in a whole new timeline and you have these new experiences, and all of a sudden your brain starts to change to perceive new things, that when you come back into what you think is the same timeline, which is not, it's a different timeline that looks the same, you're going to be in a different timeline. You're going to be changed in a way where you're going to start to maybe feel a bit of disorientation and have to integrate. So a real life example, a tangible example of this is you're living your life day to day, you're going to work, coming home, saving money, and then you might be doing that for months or years, and then all of a sudden you say, all right, it's time for me to treat myself. I'm going to go travel. I'm going to go to a new country or a timeline, potential multiverse timeline. I'm going to change the environment completely. I'm going to be around new people. I'm going to be in a new environment, a new language, a new culture. People there won't know my past, so they can only treat me in a way that I'm showing up in that moment as. And if I do this long enough, then I'm going to get feedback looping back to me so much that I'm going to perceive that I have changed as well. And even when my trip is over and I come back to my life, which I think is the old timeline, but it's not, it's a new timeline that appears to look like the old timeline. Now I'm going to have this integration process, or this disorientation, or it's going to be like a motion sickness. People call it the travel bug, where I'm not quite integrating back into my old life the way I used to, because now my mind has new hardware, a new software set up to be able to perceive more in my reality that was there before. Now, I'm not saying all of a sudden an elephant is going to appear in your room, but metaphorically, the elephant in the room will begin to appear, and you're going to start to see all these things that you were tolerating in your reality or turning a blind eye to that now are really visible, and you're going to want to change them. And what most people do is they go, oh, I just want to escape again, and go back and start traveling some more because they like the feeling of not being who they used to be. And the environment, or the perceived environment, can signal genes to turn everything back to how it was, even though you can't quite go back to how it was. It's like once you take the red pill and you wake up in the matrix, you can't go back to sleep. You can pretend to go back to sleep, but you can't, okay, because you have that memory. And if you stay strong to it and you start to act upon those new things, and not explain the experience away, and not put it into your mind as, oh, that was nice memory, that was a dream, that did it actually really happen? And this is why a lot of people want to buy the T-shirt or the knick-knack or the I love wherever I've been picture to put on their wall to remind them that the experience actually happened. Okay, so when you're timeline traveling, when you're teleporting, you're actually slipping into an alternative timeline, an alternative universe where different linear timeline lines roll out from that point. And you can do this as many times as you like because it's infinite. So you can, every time you jump from one point to another, there's an infinite amount of choices from that next one and from the next one and the next one. So navigation becomes really important, and tuning into your heart center and being able to focus and ground yourself becomes really important. And so you're not going to get these massive jumps so frequently that it freaks you out, because from an evolutionary consciousness level, it's not useful to just freak you out and have you, walking around like, oh, what's going on? I don't know where I am or who I am, or, what's happening. So these big jumps don't happen as frequently until you're prepared to do them. So an example of what I'm talking about is, everyone's seen, if you're interested in time travel, everyone's seen Back to the Future. And there's Back to the Future 2, for example, is one of probably the most interesting in terms of this conversation. And so Marty and Doc get the almanac. I'm not going to explain the story, because if you're interested in this, you would have seen it. And if you haven't seen it yet and you are interested in, go see Back to the Future, all of them, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But what happens is there's an event that skews the timelines off, where instead of things happening the way they should have, linearly based on how the reality was set up, it goes off onto this tangent where Biff becomes, king of the universe, like Donald Trump. He's like the Donald Trump parody, which is kind of scary as well at the same time. And it's just this hell. It's this hell on earth. It's chaos everywhere. And so Marty comes back to his, present timeline, thinking everything's the way it was. But because the event happened back 50 years ago, and the timeline rolled out, he comes back in a timeline where his father's gone, dead. His mum's married to Biff. Biff's this, rich asshole that rules the world. And, he's just like, what the fuck is going on? And he has this meltdown and this freak out. And then, Doc runs in and is like, okay, stop. This isn't the only timeline. This isn't, You're the only reality. You're not stuck here. And let's not stay here anymore. Let's go back to the event before the event happened, correct the timeline, and when we come back to this time in the present, it will be restored back to how it should have been, or better. And of course, that's how the story unfolds. So this is why, people spend so much time changing their mind and doing affirmations and, going to the gym and being healthy, and each time you eat right or you make a change that's going to put you onto another timeline in the future. Every time, every moment you do that is putting you into a different timeline. And so most of the time these shifts just appear as living life. But some of them can be quite drastic. Some of the jumps can be really, really big. And it can be like flying halfway around the world on an airplane. And when you get off, you jet lagged, and it takes a few days to adjust to your new timeline. And so this is one area talking about in terms of teleportation. Okay, now I'm sure that as you develop this skill, that you'll be able to navigate yourself into whatever timeline you want from any timeline you want. And I'm sure that the advancement of that is not just steering yourself through these infinite timelines, but it's actually taking the body from one point in time to another point in time, like what we expect teleportation would be, where you just bloop, you beam yourself over to another country. You don't even need an aeroplane anymore. But there's stages. Obviously, it's like when you go to the gym and you want to be fit and healthy. You don't go in there and lift 100 kilograms over your head first time you get in there. You get in there and you start. First thing you got to do is start turning up. You got to start practicing the habit and the skills, and then you build up to your ability amped up. Okay. So, but that's just a concept too. Maybe you can just do it and straight away, depending on what you believe, right? So, but the point I'm trying to make is wherever your mindset and your perception of reality is now to where you perceive you want it to be, that in itself is a teleportation. That in itself is a jump in consciousness and in through time space. So stacking onto that, because once you pierce the veil here, you get access to all these abilities based on a new frame of consciousness from which you're looking at it from. So the next one, which I think is really interesting, is levitation.